I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we're going to play around with a little observation I have made during some of my crude swatching videos. I call these swatches of the acid dyes that I do crude because when we're adding just a little bit of the dye powder onto yarn, moving it around, we're getting a sense of the hue, but this isn't really telling us about the color intensity or how much color we might have at, say, a 1% depth of shade. It's just a fast and dirty way to see how the colors may perform if we're going to be dyeing with the dry powders directly versus the dyes already dissolved in some liquid. With a couple of colors on some of these more recent swatches, specifically Dharma's Twilight Gray and Prochem's Violet, I have seen different results that may be the result of me starting with the dye bath being hot or cold when I'm doing the swatches, because sometimes I set it up when it's already on the stove and things are hot. Other times I set it up on the countertop without any heat. There are other variables and factors that could come into play to vary the color that we're seeing on the yarn, but today we're going to take a look at heat and set up two pans, one that's hot, one that's cold, with the same amount of acid, and then swatch these colors on there to see if we see any differences. In addition to the Twilight Gray and Prochem Violet that I've already mentioned, I pulled some other colors that I'm unsure if when you add the dye relative to the heat of the yarn, if that makes a difference. So I pulled Sea Spray, Sage Leaf, Prochem's Lilac, just in case I mislabeled one of the swatches that I had done and I had just accidentally swapped the colors. Hyacinth, which is a color that when I add it cold, you don't really see it. It kind of disappears, and then it shows up when things are hot, so I thought that would be fun to put in. And then Dark Navy, which sometimes, I forget if it can lean like a little bit purple or brown at first. I think as soon as you add heat, it changes, but the ChemKnits patron suggested I add that into the mix, and so let's have it there as well. The nice thing about having so many different colors that we are going to be investigating today, it means that some of these may be the same in both pans, and so that should give us a little bit of a control. I suppose I don't technically have a color here that's a control, but we'll see how much space is left on the yarn after we add the dye. Today we're going to dye 200 grams of Bare Knit Picks Swish DK yarn. This yarn is 100% superwash merino wool. And if you would like to learn more about this yarn base or any of the other dyes and tools that I use in my videos, I have links and affiliate links down in the video description to try to make it as easy as possible for you to replicate my results or try my experiments yourself to see if you get similar or different results. I'm very excited I've started using my hot plate again more because we'll be able to look at hot and cold side by side on my countertop. Right now the hot plate is off, but to each of these full-size 4-inch deep catering steam pans, I've added 2 tablespoons of white vinegar plus 1 liter or approximately 4 cups of tap water. And I'll bring over the yarn now that was just pre-soaked in plain tap water with no acid. And I'm going to arrange the yarn to sort of spread it out here in the pans as much as possible. I'm less concerned about what the finished dry yarn looks like and more interested in what things look like before and after we add heat, because there are some pigments that need heat to start showing up more. Now, it would be great if I had a second hot plate. So then, as we looked at this on one skein, we could then look at it on the other and like turn the heat on without moving it. But we're gonna do the best we can. And so now I'm gonna start heating up this hot plate. I want things to get nice and steamy, so I am going to cover this with some tin foil, so that way as it starts heating up, the heat will be trapped and everything in the pan should get nice and warm. After just 5 minutes, we are steamy, but not necessarily hot everywhere yet, so I am going to try to stir things up. Yeah, we're starting to get warm and it's nice and steamy, but the edges are still a little cold. And so I'm just stirring it to try to distribute the heat a little bit better. And the same with moving the water through, again, to just help even out the heat. But we should be ready soon. We're about to get started, but I do have another skein of Swish DK I pre-soaked with some vinegar to use as a yarn mop to wipe my gloved hands onto, so that way we don't leave any dye behind. All right. And while we are dealing with the dry dye powders, I will be wearing a respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves. All right, I reduced the heat. Let's go ahead and start with the Twilight Gray. So I'm going to take a pinch of the dye, apply some cold, and then in the approximately same spot, apply some hot. And I see a difference right now. Cold, I see pink. Hot, I still see some pinks in here, but there's a lot more blue as well. The pinks are still present. You can kind of see it broken there. But that is pretty dramatic. Here is our hot sample, and it feels mostly like a purpley blue. You can see the breaking, some brighter blue, some more pink. Cold, you still feel a little bit of the blue, but the whole thing feels overall so much more pink. And when I brought this over to the heat last time, that didn't change significantly. It did change some though. Okay, next up is the Prochem Violet. And this is the color that I saw froth really strangely when I went to dip dye. At least I think it was this color and not the lilac. So that's why we're going to try both. But looks like I'm seeing a very similar phenomena where I'll tap this one first. So here's that violet hot, and that looks like a beautiful violet color. And here it is cold. I'm not going to zoom in right now because I think that these differences are very similar and like sort of go along with what we saw with the Twilight Gray, but wow. All right, let's try dark navy. It's possible a lot more colors do this than I thought. Put a little bit more on the hot. Dark navy is one of my favorite colors. Okay. So there it is here. And there. I mean, it's also possible I added more dye. The difference here is very subtle. Maybe I'll add a tiny bit more over here. It's possible it'll get deeper once we add heat, but I'm gonna need to buy more navy. One of those colors that I use the most. Okay, the differences here may not show up on camera. It is super subtle. The color both feels blue, it just feels a little bit more intense where it's hot. Okay, next up we've got some Prochem Lilac, which I'm going to do next to the violet. And try to do a similar, to the best of my ability, I'm trying to do a similar amount. Obviously there will be some variation, but if we're dealing with a color that we know breaks, we are likely to maybe see a difference, because if some of the pigments start striking faster where it's hot, then where it's cold, that could be a difference. But by all accounts, the lilac looks very similar. Both of them have a bit of a pinkish halo there. So I think those original results were absolutely the violet. But you can see why I was confused, because this looks a lot more like the lilac than it did the violet in my swatching blue video. All right, next up, we've got another purpley color. We've got some hyacinth. This is like quickly becoming one of my favorite colors to play with. It's a beautiful bluish purple, but see here, I'm gonna tap it out, and it almost looks gray. It kind of disappeared. And here, we're disappearing a little bit as well.
but you immediately see a lot more pigment. And that's not because I didn't add very much pigment here. This will turn darker once we heat it up because, well, that's something we've seen in the past. So we know to expect it. In addition to wiping the dye off on the yarn mop, I'm then drying my gloves on a paper towel so I can try to avoid introducing dye into these containers. Next up is sage leaf, which can be a tricky color. Sometimes I see a color come out towards the end with it, and so like it sort of is different towards the beginning of where you dissolved it and the end. And okay, right here it's looking super soft. It's doing something very similar to the hyacinth actually, which is developing. It's getting more and more pigmented. But here, see a little bit more breaking, but the color is immediately deeper when we use it with the heat. And it feels not quite as yellow as pistachio, but it feels less pigmented. And again, I'm pretty sure that this is not about the amount of the color that I used, but more about whether or not it was hot. Okay, and then finally, I'm going to bring in a fair amount of some sea spray, and hopefully I've been writing this down pretty well. Whoa. Okay, in the heat as I tap this out, this turned a beautiful teal green. Sea spray is a color that breaks, and it's looking very different when it's cold. Wow. That is looking so much more blue than this one right here. Now, that could shift once we apply heat to it, but that's really, really cool.
As we've been sitting here, I see a little bit more yellow in our Twilight gray here. This one is still looking extremely pink, but I am seeing more blues come through. And maybe I see a little bit more blue coming through here in the Prochem Violet, but it does not look anything like it does where it was hot. The navies are looking much more similar. This has deepened in color as it has had some time. The hyacinth isn't quite as bright yet, but it is getting brighter. I'm seeing lots of fun speckles around the sage leaf, like blue speckles. Again, it's getting deeper, not quite matching here. And the sea spray, the breaking patterns are different, but while I think that these colors looked different when I first added it, this is still cold, and we're gonna let this sit for, I don't know, 20 minutes maybe? In just this short period of time, this color is feeling very, very similar between the two. So now, as I mentioned, I'm gonna let this sit for 20 minutes just here on the countertop. Whether we are heating and we've got our steam in here, or we're gonna sit still at room temperature on the countertop to see what, if any, changes happen. And in the meantime, I'm gonna go steam set the yarn mop a bit. It has been 20 minutes. And let's look and see. So I love that there's a little bit of green in that Twilight gray. I think the most notable difference from now to what we saw before is that the hyacinth is looking way, way, way brighter than it did before. It's looking extremely similar to the one with the heat. I think that without heat, it just takes some time for whatever is happening, maybe when it interacts with acid. I don't really know. The sage leaf looks a little bit different, but I see elements of some of those yellows in here. I think some more of those will pop up once we start heating things up. But the most difference is still that Prochem Violet is definitely the most different. So what I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna reduce the heat here, is I'm gonna take this over to the stove. And now we're at the stove, and we're gonna start heating it up. I have the heat on high for now, but I think that I'm not gonna cover it yet. Things will heat up pretty quickly, but I'm gonna actually I changed my mind. I'm gonna go ahead and cover it, but I'm also gonna set a timer for 10 minutes, and so we'll see how this looks after 10 minutes of heat. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and let this hot plate yarn continue to heat for at least another 10 minutes. Then we'll turn off the heat. I'll be nearby, so I'll make sure things don't dry out. But yeah, I think that today I'm not going to add any more color. I think I'll use this yarn for an over dyeing project later on because I kind of want to see what things we can conclude, if any, once the yarn is dry. I hear the bubbling. I'm going to make the heat even lower. Remove this and wait for the steam to go down a little bit. I would say that we have some more yellows coming through from our sage leaf. There's a little bit more blues in the Twilight gray. That is feeling more similar now. It still feels very pink, but I think the other one also feels very pink. I'm also seeing some more blues on the violet come through here. But I see a lot more of the red, and like most of the dye in all of these has absorbed by now. There's maybe a hint of some pink left. So I'm gonna go ahead and heat this for 20 more minutes. Then I'm gonna turn off the heat and let it cool off in the pan so we can look at the skeins side by side in our cooled off pans. And our yarn mop has now been steam set for 30 minutes. So I'm also gonna set this guy aside to cool completely. And of course here on the hot plate, we are at the opposite orientation that we were on the stove, but it's been heating for over 30 minutes. I'm gonna turn it off. And whenever I turn off the hot plate, I also unplug it. That way I know that it is off. But it does tend to take a little while for the hot plate itself to cool off. So I'm gonna go ahead and set this aside by my sink so it can start cooling off a little bit. The yarn has cooled off, and here we have the pan where we applied the dyes while the yarn was hot and while it was cold. And if we compare the navy, hyacinth, sea spray, sage leaf, and then Prochem lilac, those colors feel very similar now that we've heat set both of them. The Dharma Twilight Gray and the Prochem Violet do feel more different. Okay, I have tried to orient the trays so we can see all the colors on camera easily, where we have our Twilight Gray and then our violets. The violets are the most different for sure. The color when we added it hot is a lot more even. Yes, there may be a little bit evidence of breaking here, but overall it looks like a very blue violet color. When we added the dye cold, there's a ton of breaking in here. I see a lot of different separations of pinks and blue, but the whole color overall feels a lot more pink. And so I think this has something to do with the different rates that those pink and blue pigments bind to the yarn. And so that changes the overall feel that we have to the color. Now, what I don't know is if we would feel similar differences if we were starting with liquid dyes. And so that could be something to investigate in the future. When it comes to our Twilight Gray, I feel, I guess, a lot more blue. There's still a lot of breaking in here. I mean, we have a little bit of yellow. I see pink and blue all from that color. Over here, I feel predominantly pink. I don't really see as much of the yellow, and there are some similarities here. I don't think I would call these out as different, if not having this color feel so blue sometimes and then so pink others. And so I would say that Twilight Gray is just a tricky color overall, because I do have examples of it where it breaks into like a teal and more purple color, and then other examples where it just feels navy. And so this is something that could have a lot more to do with the amount of acid that we have and how quickly the colors are striking. So again, we're gonna need to play around with Twilight Gray more, but I feel like I've played with this color a number of different times. But anyway, I would say that the violet that we have there is absolutely the one where we saw the biggest difference, and that's pretty striking. Now I would like to give a huge shout out and thank you to the ChemKnits Fiber patrons, including Karen Segal, Jessica Parco, Don Jans, Tamara Svanez, and the rest of the Alpaca and Silk patrons whose names you'll see on the screen right now. The ChemKnits Patreon is a really great way to help support the content here on this channel, and you can get some really cool perks like shout outs in videos, early access to new content, and even at certain levels you can get some permanent coupons to the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. You can find more information at patreon.com/ChemKnits, and you'll also find a link directly to it in the video description. What do these results mean? Well, it can mean that if you want to get a particular color with that Prochem violet, it could be worth making sure you're starting hot. That is the one that is still the most surprising with how different it looks between the two pans. And it's worth being aware of the conditions where you're starting things, especially if you're going to compare, say, some of my crude swatches from one pan to another. If I started with it cold or I started with it hot, that could change the relationship. So each swatch project and picture is really best used as a comparison of the dyes in that pan to themselves versus comparing one pan to another, even though I do that sometimes. The amount of acid absolutely could be a variable that comes into play as well. There are lots of other little variables that we could consider, including the amount of time before adding heat, how hot the actual temperature could make a difference as well. But as you make observations of things behaving differently, sometimes it's worth taking a moment to go and see if you can reproduce those results that made you a little bit curious and have some questions. And so anyway, I hope that this video has been helpful. We'll go wash and look at the dry yarn in a moment. But while I have your attention, make sure you're subscribed, and if you enjoy videos like this, give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments if there are any other colors that you think that I should explore in a side-by-side project like this one. We are gonna wash our yarn. The dye baths were clear on everything, but I did see a little bit of staining, maybe from that violet color. I did not make a note over which one was which, so we'll have to just, oh, that's the yarn mop. I was like, why don't they look very similar? So we'll see if I can tell the difference towards the end or not. Or maybe I'll go back at the footage and check out which color had which zip tie. But the good news is that I'm not seeing any bleeding. Yeah, let's go ahead and add some dish soap. That was a big vlog. Sometimes if there will be bleeding, adding soap is something that will get you to start seeing that. But I don't think I'm seeing any color come out, which is always what we want to see. Now, I mentioned this before, but I will be over dyeing, I think, the main colorways, not the yarn mop from this video, but the main colorways in another video, just because, well, for one, people have requested more over dyeing content in general, but also because I wanted to sort of see and take a closer look at the yarn once it was dry here and be able to maybe compare the two skeins to one another. If I over dyed them now, we wouldn't be able to make any comparisons. But anyway, I am going to finish rinsing out the soap. Then I'm going to put the yarn through my spin dryer and hang it up to dry. And here is the finished dry yarn. But there is one thing I want to point out before we look and see if we can have any conclusions. There's a hint of some pink over here, which now that I move it, it looks a little bit more like some rogue speckles. But given that this was pinkish, I was like, did I get some color transfer from the nylon zip tie? And like there's a little bit of blue up here, which, you know, I'm starting to think it's more of a coincidence looking at the patterning, but I was starting to be concerned because my nylon zip ties that I use, and I do have an affiliate link for them in the video description, although double check that they are reusable nylon zip ties that you can move because sometimes Amazon updates the listing. But anyway, they do start off as white, and I've been really lucky in that I can use them over and over, and I never see color transfer from them onto the yarn. But I also don't often have a ton of white yarn left. But given that there's other like little speckles, I'm now thinking it's less the zip tie and that it's a coincidence. But it may not be, so I wanted to have this on the record in case I observe something later on. Without labels, there's not a lot that I can conclude between these colorways. And honestly, editing Rebecca will pop back in to let me know if I'm wrong with my assumptions of which one started cold and which one started hot. But I think that this one started hot with the bluer tie and the redder tie started cold. And the reason for that is what I think is the violet over here. It is significantly more broken when we started cold. And I do see a little bit of some breaking and some pinks in here, but not nearly as much as what we have over here. See, this is the one that I think started cold, and you see a lot more of that red in there, whereas over here we have a lot more of that bluer violet color. Ultimately, the differences are really, really subtle, and I would love to play around with this Prochem violet color, cold and hot on its own, sometime in the future, playing with it side by side just to see how similar and different things feel. So can it make a difference when you're dyeing yarn if you start with your dye bath cold or hot? Yes. Yes, it can. There are some pigments that need a little bit more heat to show their full character. And if it's a blend of colors where they behave differently with heat, and maybe one strikes a lot faster when it's hot and a lot slower when it's cold, then maybe you could see more significant breaking than otherwise you might see, like with that violet color. But otherwise, the colors we used were pretty similar. I would say that they were fairly similar. There might be some subtle differences, but again, given that we were doing this sort of crude swatching technique, I can't entirely draw too many more conclusions from this yarn. But what I can say is that this yarn, I think, is a fun starting place to create another kind of colorway moving forward. I don't know what I'm going to do yet to over-dye it, so feel free to leave some suggestions down in the comments section. Honestly, the two skeins are close enough together that I feel like whatever I do next, it could be the same colorway, and so that's always nice for a starting point. Finally, we have our yarn mop, and I need to draw your attention to this color. Whatever I have over here, whether it was actually, you know what, maybe it was putting some navy on top of like the violet or something, because I was like, it looks like it's like a navy broken pink kind of thing. The colors are probably layered together. That makes more sense than some of the other thoughts that I had. But anyway, that section is gorgeous. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and please don't forget to subscribe to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. In addition to this Dyepot PS series that comes out at unpredictable times every month, basically as soon as I finish the video and get the most recent newsletter out on the ChemKnits Patreon, I post regular videos at least twice a week, and we do live streams and all kinds of fun things. So you should subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of it. And if you've been a fan for a while, or if you're a new fan and want to help support the content here even more, go and check out the ChemKnits Patreon. You can find a link to more details down in the video description. I love playing around with different conditions and tweaking different variables when it comes to dyeing yarn, because sometimes you find a situation with a particular color where it does something that just is a little bit unexpected, but you can control it if you are using it under the right conditions, and that makes it so much fun. It's less fun when you're trying to do something and a dye behaves unpredictably and you get a color that's way different than you were expecting, but I mean, that's the whole reason why we do these experiments, is to see if we can reproduce observations that we've made. Thank you so much for watching.